In the previous episode, we reached the end of the evolution of the Soviet Homeland Air Defense fighters. What remains the more detailed presentation of their capabilities regarding range, engagement zone and mission profiles. Finally, the inventory change and transition of the PVO, the Soviet Homeland Air Defense between fighter and generation, will be presented. For the fighters of the Homeland Air Defense, the combat radius and the time to fly to edge of the combat radius were one of the most important parameters, which determined the size of the area what could be defended against certain speed of target. The utilizable top speed of the fighters shows some correlation with their theoretical top speed, therefore it is worth to present them to understand the relation between them. The most interesting fighters were produced after the second half of the 60s, with air-to-air missiles, so let's look at them. The Su-15TM was capable of reaching a Mach 2.1 at an altitude of 12,000 meters with two R-98M missiles. It could maintain this speed up to a ceiling of 17,000 meters. The top speed of the MiG-23P even exceeded this, reaching a Mach 2.35 with a maximum altitude of 80,000 meters. For the MiG-25PD fighter, the widely known and often cited top speed 2.83 Mach is confirmed by the chart. The ceiling between Mach 2.2 and Mach 2.6 speed could be as high as 21,000 meters. It should be noted that the later MiG-31 could also reach this speed with 4 R-33 missiles. Nice figures are these, aren't they? Well, after that, let's check what the reality was in terms of range and combat cruising speed. The figures on the diagram show the distance and elapsed time from starting the takeoff. The elapsed time does not include activities following the alarm, climbing into cockpit, engine startup, taxi to runway, etc. The minimum distance and the minimum time are considered with a maximum afterburner use almost during the whole interception. The third data point refers to mission profile with a full afterburner climb, followed by an intercept at maximum subsonic speed using maximum military power. This essentially means a speed of around Mach 0.9. The middle data point covered the mission profile with partial afterburner following a maximum performance climb. Each of these mission profiles consider flying at high altitudes at 10,000 meters or even higher. The fighters fly back to their home base using their economical performance. I proceed according to the ascending distances, even if it does not represent a chronological order. With the maximum performance, the MiG-23P reached 130 km in 8 minutes and 40 seconds. With the intermediate power mission profile, the combat radius increased to 170 km. Time to the edge of the combat radius was 12 minutes and 20 seconds. Extending the combat radius by 30% increased the intercept time by 41%. With the subsonic mission profile, the combat radius was 285 km, the time to get there was 29.5 minutes. The additional 76% range increased the flight time by about 2.5 times. Of course, the maximum range of the aircraft is higher than this, as these profiles do not consider drop tank. Also, the outbound leg of the mission profile is not considered with the most economical cruising speed. Despite its higher theoretical top speed compared to the Su-15TM, the MiG-23P had shorter range. This was due to a 50% smaller internal fuel capacity, which significantly limited both subsonic and supersonic range. With two R-98M missiles, the Su-15TM reached 295 km of distance under 11.5 minutes. This is 1 minute shorter than the MiG-23's intermediate intercept time, but with 73% longer range, while the Su-50TM's takeoff weight was only 2 tons higher. With the intermediate performance, the Su-15TM reached 400 km in 21.5 minutes and 590 km in 36.5 minutes. The maximum range of the Su-15TM was twice of the MiG-33's, but it could reach 400 km distance faster than the MiG-23P flew out to 285 km. The iconic MiG-25 takeoff weight with 4 R-40 missiles was 37 tons, a little over twice the weight of the Su-50TM. The result was that the MiG-25P could reach a distance of 400 km under 13 minutes and 10 seconds. It could reach the same distance in 40% less time than the Su-50TM did. The 40 tons of fuel capacity allowed the Foxbat to have this high performance. It used the engines on full afterburner power almost during the whole mission. Time to reach 580 km of distance is 37.5 minutes, to 600 km is 45.5 minutes. It is clearly visible from these figures that the MiG-25 was not optimized for subsonic flight at any altitude. The range is barely increased with an increase of 8 minutes of flying compared to the 580 and 600 km range cases. The Tu-128 is a long-range champion compared to all other PVO fighters of its time, reaching a distance of 480 km in under 25 minutes, a distance comparable to the intermediate performance or the Su-50TM. It reached 810 km in 52 minutes, and flight to 1070 km took 71.5 minutes with 2 500 kg missiles under its wings. With economical cruising speed, its combat radius was 1250 km. The other PVO fighters could be better sprinters, but in a long-distance race, everyone else was beaten by the Tu-128, hands down. The takeoff weight of the Tu-128 exceeded even the MiG-25s by 6 tons, with only 1 ton higher internal fuel capacity. The takeoff weight of the MiG-25P was 37 tons with a 14 tons of fuel, while the Tu-128's internal capacity was 15 tons with 43 tons of takeoff weight. The fundamental difference was between the two heavyweight players, that the MiG-25P took 9 minutes to reach 20,000 meters of altitude, then dash from there at 2,500 km per hour speed. The Tu-128 climbed only to 11,000 meters, only under 3 minutes and 20 seconds, then maintained only 1,300 km per hour speed from there. The top speed of the two fighters in practice were very different, hence the dramatically different effective range. The MiG-25's shorter range came at the cost of its higher speed. Its subsonic range, thanks to its poor aerodynamics, meant that it was spectacularly behind the Tu-128. The combat radius figures were the basis to decide which fighter aircraft type was deployed to which part of the Soviet Union. Where airbases were available in about every 150 or 200 kilometers, in the European part of the Soviet Union on the Baltic coast, the MiG-23 family was suitable and the other fighter types before the Flagger family. Up to 400 km distance, the MiG-25 family was the fastest and protected the largest area. Therefore, it was mainly responsible for the defense of the western, the European part of the Soviet Union. At a range of between 400 and 600 km, the MiG-25 defended approximately the same area as the Su-50TM, but with greater firepower because it carried 4 R-40 missiles, whereas the Su-50TM carried only 2 R-98Ms. At airfield densities between 500 and 1000 km, the North Sea coastline and the Far East, the Tu-128 was the only choice, or the older Yak-25Ps, especially if it was necessary to fly far out to the sea. The MiG-31 was essentially a universal PVO fighter, but we will come back to that later. Now that the theoretical and practical speeds of fighters are known, it becomes clear how much area can be defended by a fighter. What is important is not only how far fighters flew within a given time, but also how and what speeds they were able to intercept targets. The diagram should be interpreted in the following way. In the bottom left corner, the fighter's home base is at 0 km distance and 0 km flyby distance. The target on the diagram approaches from above. The x-axis is the flyby distance of the target. The diagram shows both the distance and flyby distance limits of the interception for a target with 1,500 km of speed at 15,000 meters of altitude, considering 600 km of detection range from the airbase. As the speed of the target increases, the area of the possible interception is more compressed. Both the distance with zero and larger flyby distance become smaller with increasing target speed. Why? Compared to SAMs, the takeoff and climb time of fighter aircraft to an altitude of 10 or 15,000 meters takes minutes. In comparison, the older SAMs accelerated to about Mach 1.5 or a bit higher speed, about 3 to 5 seconds following the launch, thanks to the booster stage or stages of the missiles. Let's see the mission profile in detail of the MiG-25, how it flew its shortest and fastest interception. The MiG-25 began the takeoff with 14.2 tons of fuel without drop tank. The takeoff was performed with full afterburner thrust, which was maintained almost during the whole climb to 20,000 meters of altitude. The Foxbat reached an altitude of 10,000 meters at about 90 kilometers from the base. Following about 30 kilometers of horizontal acceleration, the MiG began a slight climb to 11,000 meters, which an altitude was reached at 700 kilometers from the base. That was followed by a higher climb rate phase from to 20,000 meters. By the time the MiG reached 13,000 meters of altitude, 8.5 minutes had elapsed from the takeoff, and the Foxbat was about 200 kilometers from the base. Roughly 8 tons of fuel was consumed. For comparison, this would be enough to fully refuel 2 MiG-33 fighters. The Foxbat continued the climb and reached Mach 2.35 at about 16,000 meters of altitude and finished the high climb rate phase at 20,000 meters of altitude. From this point, only partial afterburner power was used to maintain Mach 2.35 speed. Contrary to legends and popular belief, in general the MiG-25 did not perform the interception with Mach 2.83 speed because the price was too high in terms of range. After reaching 20,000 meters of altitude, only a minimal climb was performed thanks to the decreasing weight of the plane because of the high rate of fuel consumption. When the plane reached 400 kilometers of distance from the base, it reached about 22,000 meters of altitude. As a final act before missile launch, a small zero climb maneuver could be performed against targets like the SR-71 to increase the performance of the R-40 missile. At the end of the high-speed leg of the mission, only about 4 tons of fuel remained from the initial 14 tons. After interception, the aircraft descended to 11,000 meters and returned to home at a Mach 0.8. After landing, only a 1.6 tons of fuel remaining as an emergency reserve. The distance of 400 kilometers from this profile is shown on the drawing about interception distance and flyby distance. It is amazing that the practical top speed of the MiG-25P, the Mach 2.35, exceeded the theoretical top speed all other PVO fighters with one exception. The theoretical top speed of the second placed MiG-23 was almost the same. With the maximum Mach 2.83 speed, combat radius would be even shorter than 400 kilometers. Even the restricted Mach 2.35 speed allowed only about 4 minutes high-speed dash from the 13 minutes of total outbound flight time. From the total available 12.6 tons of fuel, without considering the reserve, 80% of the total usable fuel was consumed to fly 400 kilometers of distance. What could the MiG-25 have done against the SR-71 or the B-70 bomber if the latter had been produced? For a Mach 3 speed target with 600 km detection range from the base, the MiG-25 could only have intercepted the SR-71 about 300 km of flyby distance due to the reaction time calculated from speed and range. This is why the automated integrated air defense systems was necessary, like the Vozduch, to intercept the SR-71. In a sense, it was necessary to fly with almost 100% accuracy to achieve a successful intercept by flying along a calculated ideal intercept trajectory. If a situation ever arose where a missile launch against an SR-71 could have been authorized, only the MiG-25P and the MiG-23P would have a chance of shooting it down from all the fighters which were developed before the arrival of the MiG-31. The MiG-23 needed the improved R-24T missile to do that, so not every MiG-23 could do that, only the R-24T capable ones. The MiG-25 could have shot down the SR-71 not because it had a top speed of Mach 2.8, or as some silly legend says that it flew with Mach 3 and chased the target. The high speed was necessary because of the high interception altitude and timely arrival to a suitable location of the missile launch. Against a high-speed target, missile launch is only realistically possible in a head aspect situation. The commonly cited rear aspect launch against an SR-71 is partially a fantasy. About the SR-71 and the urban legends built around will be discussed another time. After that, it's worth taking a quick look at the last PVO fighter, the MiG-31. With a similar high-speed intercept profile to the MiG-25, its maximum range was 720 km. It took 8 minutes to climb 19,000 meters, then maintained the Mach 2.35 speed just as the MiG-25 did. The final altitude of the outbound leg was at 21,000 meters. It feels a huge leap ahead, but not only because of its supersonic performance. Its subsonic parameters simply outclass the Foxbat, and in fact every other type. The combat radius with Mach 0.8 cruising speed was 1,200 km and 1,500 km with 2 underwing drop tanks. The MiG-31 achieved and surpassed the subsonic range of the Tu-128, while still was capable to high-speed interception just as the MiG-25, but with 80% higher range. In contrary to the MiG-25, the Foxhound was able to perform combat air patrol. The subsonic patrol time at 10,000 meters with a Mach 0.85 reached 3 hours and 30 minutes, which could be extended to 7 hours with a single area refuel for the later manufactured MiG-31 variants which got this capability. Now we are familiar with the range and speeds of the fighters, let's see their maximum target speed. The combination of radars and air-to-air missiles determine the characteristics of the targets they could engage in terms of speed and attack direction. The relative speed of targets and the required time to carry out the work in the cockpit to lock and launch a missile determines the minimum detection distance to avoid getting within the minimum engagement range. In addition, the kinematics and other characteristics of the missile determine the engagement zone that the fighters, we can say, pushed ahead itself. Before the advent of supersonic fighters and air-to-air missiles, interception at high altitude was only possible from the rear or only partially from side rear. The engagement range with cannon was less than 1 km, rather in the max 500 meter scale to achieve reasonably probability of distraction, while the guns in the tail section of the bombers would have been able to return fire effectively to only a gun-equipped fighter. This era ended in the late 50s and early 60s for the first-line fighters. The MiG-19PM with the RS-2U missile was the child of this new era. However, even with an air-to-air missile, it was still only effective against a subsonic target, and it could be launched only in rear engagement from up to 3.5 km of distance. The fighter had to maneuver behind the target at high altitude, where the fighter was barely faster than the B-52 or B-47 bombers. But at least it was possible to launch a missile outside of the range of the gun turret of the American bombers. The MiG-19 was not able to reach the speed of sound with 4 missiles under its wings, even if considered a supersonic fighter. That was true only without air-to-air missiles. The next step in the evolution was the appearance of the real supersonic capable fighters, at least with a Mach 1.5 speed with air-to-air missiles. The top speed of the Su-90 at a very high altitude reached Mach 1.9. It could engage targets up to Mach 1.4 speed, but still only from the rear aspect was possible to attack. The maximum range of the engagement zone was restricted by the short kinematic range of the missile, and its large drag compared to the later generation of air-to-air missiles. The maximum range of the RS-2 missile was only 5 km against a subsonic target and only 3 km against a supersonic target, thanks to the smaller speed gap between the missile and the target. For the Su-9 and Su-11, the maximum speed of the targets at an altitude of 10 km was only about 1500 km per hour, which decreased with an altitude to about 850 km per hour at sea level. This data shall be interpreted as the flight altitude of the fighter and its target is roughly the same. The maximum difference in altitude can be only a few kilometers, which decreases as the target speed increases. A fighter flying with a subsonic speed at 10 km cannot shoot down a supersonic target at 15 or 12,000 meters of altitude. Increasing the speed of the fighter was also necessary to reach the altitude of the supersonic targets. The maximum target speed of 1500 km per hour is interesting because it is considerably higher than the speed of the subsonic bombers, but it is way too low to be effective against the Mach 2 capable B-58 Hustler. The missile-equipped Su-9 and Su-11 would only have been able to intercept the B-58 if it were flying a mission profile where it could not sustain a speed exceeding Mach 1.4 for an extended period. The side and head aspect engagement were made possible by the appearance of the semi-active radar-guided missiles and fighters with sufficiently long detection range radars. This essentially started with the Su-11 and the Yak-28 with new radars and the R-8 AMAR semi-active guided missile. The radar could detect a B-52 bomber from about 40 km. It provided the sufficient time to engage. Even against high-speed incoming targets, the time between detection and reaching the minimum launch distance with precise ground guidance was enough to perform the necessary actions before missile launch. Above an altitude of 7,000 meters, against an incoming target with the R-8 AMAR missile, the maximum target speed was 1500 km per hour, and at 12,000 meters it was 2000 km per hour. Against a receding target, the maximum target speed was essentially on par with the RS-2 missile, but with longer maximum engagement range. Against incoming targets, the Su-15 with the R-98M missile was effective up to 1500 km per hour at an altitude of 6000 meters. The minimum engagement altitude decreased to 2000 meters, and the target speed increased slightly to 1600 km over the Yak-28s. At high altitude, the target speed reached 2400 km per hour. The R-98M could already be launched from low altitudes from behind the target at a speed of up to 1250 km per hour, with a maximum target altitude of 18,000 meters. For the R-98MR version, the target altitude increased to 20,000 meters, and against subsonic targets, it was suitable up to 24,000 meters. The missile made it possible to shoot down the B-58 bomber at its maximum speed, Mach 2.0. The other variant of the R-8M missile was the infrared-guided R-8MT, which could be launched from behind the target. Generally, one semi-active radar-guided and one infrared-guided missile were carried to improve the probability of hit in case of electronic jamming. The shorter-range MiG-23P with its R-40R and T missiles and its radar can be considered a half-generation improvement. Its maximum target speed was 1500 km per hour at low altitude, 3000 km per hour at an altitude of 10,000 meters, which remained the same up to 20,000 meters. The maximum target altitude reached 24,000 meters, where the maximum target speed still was 1500 km per hour. Against a receding target at low altitude, the target speed was 1200 km per hour, which increased to 2000 km per hour at an altitude of 7000 meters and only decreased above 20,000 meters. At low altitude, targets faster than the speed of sound were not expected. Even the AGM-28 Hound Dog missile was subsonic if used its low-level profile, so the MiG-23's low-altitude target speed was more than adequate. However, its maximum target speed of 3000 km per hour made it possible to intercept the B-58 and under certain conditions the SR-71. The interception against the latter was regularly practiced over Baltic Sea. It should be added that if the SR-71 detection happened only from 600 km compared to the home base, the MiG-23P had a much smaller maximum interception flyby distance compared to the MiG-25. The best of the best for high interception was the MiG-25 family in the late 70s. Its PD variant with an upgraded radar was capable to shoot down a target at high altitude. The Mach 3 speed target was no problem, and neither was an AGM-28 even it flew at low altitude. As a final chapter of the story of the fighters of the PVO, it is worth to have an overview how the inventory of the PVO changed over time, using snapshots from 1965, 1976 and 1988. In 1968, the two most numerous representatives in the fleet were the MiG-17 and the Su-6 with about 20% and 28% respectively. This was followed by the MiG-19 family with the 18% and the Yak-25P with 13%. The old subsonic era Yak-25 still accounted for 11%. The Su-11, which was already in production but just being introduced, were a mere 3%, and the heaviest fighter, the Tu-128, made up only 1%. The majority of the fighter inventory consisted of planes produced in the 50s, which were outdated in the mid-60s. This was still the legacy of the Khrushchev era, when several promising interceptor development projects were stopped. The MiG-17 made up more than a quarter of the inventory, even in the mid-90s, while its production started in 1952. Interestingly, the reason was not only the lack of aircraft production capacity. The Soviet airfield network built in the 50s with hard surface runways was not suitable for operating the later designed faster and heavier new fighter types. Many of them were too short. Upgrading the air bases to have at least 2,500-meter runway was an ongoing project in the 60s and early 70s, but due to the large number of affected air bases and the poor infrastructure in many places, this process was only completed by the late 70s. There were countless airfields in Soviet Far East and Arctic regions without rail or paved road access, and the climate conditions also limited the construction pace. The underfunding of the PVO compared to the air defense missile forces was evident not only on technical side, but also on personnel side. Several pilot training schools had been closed earlier. Thus, in the 60s, they had a not so young flying staff that often did not meet the medical requirements demanded by the new supersonic types. These factors together caused the overrepresentation of the MiG-17 type even in the second half of the 60s. Let's jump ahead about a decade. By the mid-70s, the MiG-17 and the MiG-19 were heading towards extinction. The former represented only 2% and the latter just 6% of the inventory. The supersonic fighter types were now the backbone of the PVO's fleet. The Su-15 and the Su-15TM, as well as the poorly performing Su-9 and Su-11. The two versions of the Su-15 represented 19% and 12%. The Su type was 21% and the Su-11 4% of the fleet. The Tu-128 reached its peak service proportionally, but even this only made up 6%. The share of the Yak-25P essentially stagnated due to the rise of other types. It was 12% of the forces. In the year of Belenko's defection in 1976, MiG-25 fighters already reached 11% share and the MiG-23 family 6%. Now let's also see which fighter replaced which. The MiG-23 replaced all the previous types uniformly except for the Tu-128. This was necessary for countering low altitude and terrain following targets, to a limited extent intercepting the SR-71, even if its range was less than its predecessor in some cases, for example compared to the Yak-28P. The replacement of the catastrophic Su-9 and Su-11 by the MiG-23 family was a huge leap ahead in every area. It is quite interesting that the MiG-25 replaced in some location the very old MiG-19. Not only the longer range types were replaced with the new Foxbat. This was a huge leap forward these units. In 1976, overall, the MiG-25 could be considered the best fighter of the PVO. Even its low altitude capabilities were inferior to the MiG-23 except for the PD variant. More than a decade later, in 1988, the fighters of the 60s had almost completely disappeared, only the Su-15, its modern TM variant, remained in service. Together they consisted 17% of the fleet. The Yak-28 and the Tu-128 had also disappeared. The share of the MiG-23 in the fleet was colossal. 41% of the total inventory were the members of the MiG-23 family, M, MLA, MLD and P variants, thanks to its cost. It was the cheapest fighter type of the PVO from the mid-70s. The remaining portion of the fleet was relatively evenly shared by the MiG-25 family, the MiG-31 and the Su-17 types, with 16, 16 and 9% respectively. Which type replaced which? The MiG-31 replaced the Yak-28P and the Tu-128 long-range types. All the older types were replaced by the MiG-21 PDS, PD and the Su-15 TM fighters. Contrary to the popular belief, nearly 80% of the Su-27s produced were allocated to the PVO and only the remaining to the frontline aviation. The MiG-23 family was the most numerous in service both in the PVO and the frontline aviation. At the time of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, 850 of these aircraft were in service at the PVO units. By comparison, there were approximately 350 MiG-25P and about the same number of MiG-31 aircraft in the inventory by the end of the Cold War. The production of the MiG-31 ended in 1993. The MiG-23 became the most numerous aircraft in the PVO, but it had to be used only due to the financial constraints. The original plans did not include the acquisition of the MiG-23 family. Well, this was the story of the fighters of the PVO until the end of the Cold War. The lack of funds and the general political attitude of the 90s led to the massive disarmament within the Russian Air Force. For doctrinal reasons, every single engine fighter and strike aircraft were scrapped, and the MiG-23's airframe had a short lifespan anyway. The MiG-23 family essentially disappeared in Russia by the early 2000s, barely a decade after the end of the Cold War. By the end of the 90s, only the MiG-31 and the Su-27 remained in service for Homeland Air Defense tasks. The Su-15 TM also fell victim to obsolescence and financial constraints. The story ends with the organizational dissolution of the PVO in 1998, although the role itself did not disappear. If you like the video, you can share, like, subscribe or ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support it via Patreon for exchange for early access, voting on plan topics and extra content and updates about the project. So far, 10 Patreon extra content has been released, their description are in the link under the video.